So next up, we have got Nick, Earles and Elliot Rolfe from Mackrell Solicitors. Nick and Elliot are lawyers of a very special kind. Nick is a solicitor in cannabis law, and Elliot is head of Psychoactive Medicines Law team for Mackrell. They've both played significant roles in cannabis regulation and are passionate about helping shape the cannabis and psychedelic medicine sector by providing clarity and support to organisations about the law. On a personal note, they are currently helping Heroic Hearts Project UK, which, as I mentioned at the top, that they are a psychedelic charity nearly charity that I volunteer for. They're helping us with our charity application, which is proving incredibly complicated because the mention of psychoactive medicines seems to be a massive red flag to the Charity Commission. But we're working with them very closely to try and make change happen, aren't we? So please welcome Elliot and Nick.
Is it safe to assume that we're talking to an audience who are in the main in favour of sensible drugs laws? Yeah. Good. Okay, that makes things easier. Wonderful. Well, I hope I speak for everybody who's actually in the industry. When I say I was actually very grateful when I managed to get a job in drugs law. I thought, what a fantastic opportunity to work in something that can be very important to me and also enjoy it in the process. What I realized very quickly, unfortunately, is that there is nothing more frustrating than working in drugs law if you are an advocate for sensible drugs laws.
Yeah, here, Elliot. See, as lawyers working in this wonderful and colourful industry, you meet clients and you meet people with products who can safely help thousands upon thousands of people, not only physically, but also mentally. Their mental health will benefit hugely. But unfortunately, it kills us to say that perhaps maybe within the next 7 years, what you want to achieve can't be done due to the restrictive policies and regulations of our current drug laws. You see things like this cognitive dissonance of having cocaine and heroin in Schedule 2, treating it as something with therapeutic value and a little bit of potential for abuse, but then a plant like cannabis and magic mushrooms in Schedule 1 showing no therapeutic benefit and high potential for abuse, which we all know in this room. It's completely incorrect.
And you have to watch clients go round and round for months and months and sometimes years trying to get approval to work with compounds that some people could obtain in 35 minutes by ringing a number in their phone book. Now, I'm not for a second suggesting, of course, that illicitly produced compounds could be used in a clinical setting, but it does just seem a little bit like we're maintaining a large, sturdy front door with lots of locks on the front of a tent. I don't understand it personally. Anyway, so there are some upsides working in the industry, though, and then that number one being the people in this industry are some of the nicest and most well-meaning people we've ever had the pleasure of working with.
So look, we will absolutely encourage everyone here, obviously, to get involved in any way you can. You've already heard it from previous speakers. And today, what we're going to try to do is demystify some of the legal and regulatory blockades holding up legal reform in the UK. We're going to start by running through what rescheduling is and why it's such a big deal in practical terms. Then we're going to talk about what we're waiting for in terms of policy and law changes in the UK government. And finally, we're going to talk about, well, we're going to start with a summary on where we are, where the UK is on the path to legal psychedelics. If we do have time, and seeing as this is a comedy club, we might have some funny stories or interesting stories that have come about upon the state of policy in the UK. So bear with us if we do have some time.
Thanks. Actually, I think it's probably the only appropriate place to talk about drug laws, a comedy club, isn't it?
Even though drug policy is no laughing matter.
Yeah. So a quick background on us and the firm. My name's Elliot. I head up the Psychoactive Medicines Law and Regulatory team at a firm in London called Mackrell Solicitors. The firm's actually very old. It dates back to the 1800s, and it's got lots of traditional departments. We have employment, commercial, corporate, land, litigation, all those sort of things. And we've got some very new departments like the crypto and blockchain team. We've got sports media, medical cannabis, of course, and psychedelic medicine.
My name is Nick Earles. I helped Elliot set up the UK's first Psychoactive Medicines Law and Regulatory Department at Mackrell Solicitors. I'm an independent legal consultant to the psychedelics and cannabis sectors. And Elliot and I are both authors of the UK Guide to Medical Cannabis and Cannabinoid Regulation. So let's begin. So where is the UK on the path to legal psychedelics? As you all know, the psychedelic medicines in the UK is in an embryonic form. It's a nascent industry. That is to say, we are only recently beginning to sort of stave off the prevailing stigma that decades of misinformation, damaging propaganda has built up over the decades, stemming pretty much from the UN conventions. Now, these are a suite of legislation, basically, a suite of legislation that has demonized medicines and severely restricted access for decades. These conventions require states to implement domestic laws controlling drugs. Owing to this, the prospect of investigating the efficacies of psychedelic compounds on treating mental health, and indeed even studying the mechanisms of the mind, is an onerous and difficult path to navigate in every country on the world for both biotech startups and researchers. Now, the three amigos of the UK drugs world all fall into play here and are responsible for the legal control and legality of these drugs. I am, of course, referring to, you've heard it time and time again, the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, the Misuse of Drugs Regulations 2001, and my personal favorite, the Psychoactive Substances Act 2016. What a doozy. Anyway, more on that later. Elliot will discuss the former two acts in a little bit more detail. But anyway, thanks to these pieces of law, which are woefully unfit for purpose, I hear you say, the mentality that these psychedelics are harmful drugs and not curing medicines is all too real. The proof that these compounds heal has been demonstrated time and time again. Even esteemed medical professionals and healthcare experts have gone so far as to stake their reputations to say that these compounds are not addictive. Allegedly, it is impossible to be addicted to a psychedelic compound. So, Elliot, what needs to happen? Who are the bodies involved and how are they making these decisions?
That's a question that comes up quite often. So what are we waiting for? What actually has to happen to get these compounds legal? We've got the recreational side, we've got the medical side, and we'll talk about the two separate ones soon. I mean, they both urgently need reform. I think the government are probably going to progress legal reform on the medical side first, because it sounds like a more honourable request to their ear. We could go into details on both, but we'll stick to the medical side just for now. So as you know, the Misuse of Drugs Act, it separates drugs into classes A, B, and C, and this is concerned with penalties. It's about sentencing. The act tells what you can't do with drugs. And then you have this separate act, the Misuse of Drugs Regulations. That is about what people can do with drugs, how we use drugs lawfully, compliantly, and it's about licensing and exemptions, things like that. The Misuse of Drugs Regulations separates drugs into schedules, not classes. This is where the trickiness begins. So Schedule 1 drugs are drugs that are reserved, that have no medicinal value. In Schedule 1, you have drugs like DMT, MDMA, Psilocybin, LSD. All the drugs we know have enormous medicinal value. Chucked in there. If a drug's in Schedule 1, doctors can't prescribe it, patients can't legally possess it, and even to work with them from a research perspective, you need an expensive license from the Home Office, which takes an awful long time and costs a lot of money to get. So rescheduling, therefore, is where the government moves a drug from the most restrictive class to a less restrictive class, or vice versa. And that does a lot of very important things. Not only does it mean that researchers don't need this very difficult license to research with them, and it means that doctors can prescribe them, but it means that if a psychedelic or other medicine is approved abroad, we can actually prescribe it here in the UK under a specials route without it having to actually go through the 10-year billion-pound process for approval in the UK. Now, this is why everyone's talking about rescheduling, because suppose MAPS in the US, it's a psychedelic medicines company, they are most likely to be first past the post to get a psychedelic to market. They're treating PTSD, alcohol use disorder, and other things like this. So as soon as MAPS get that approved, hopefully, if we can just change the scheduling, we'll be able to use things in the UK, and that's where the changes like to begin. So the next obvious question is, what are the government waiting for before rescheduling? Well, essentially, the government wants the industry to get a psychedelic medicine all the way through the regulatory approvals process. And then they say they'll talk about rescheduling. The problem is that process, as I say, is a 10-year, billion-pound process. And that means we're not going to get a change anytime soon. You have 3-phase clinical trials, usually starting with around 20 people in phase 1, 80 to 100 in phase 2, and then maybe thousands or hundreds in phase 3. And the problem is, before you even start that process, you need permission from somebody else. Any guesses as to who that is?
You know it, come on.
It's the government, yes. And so then, if you want to do any work, if this is the licensing with, say, DMT,
MDMA,
LSD,
mescaline,
psilocybin,
methyldioxyamphetamine,
2-aminopropylbenzofuran.
You get the idea.
Yeah, and this is where the problem of prohibition creeps into the medical realm, and circular arguments with government start interfering with progress. So it goes a bit like this. Researchers say, government, can you please move these very useful compounds out of Schedule 1 to, say, Schedule 2, so we can get them through the regulatory approvals process more easily? To which the government replies, reschedule them? No. Don't you realize we have a regulatory approvals process for that? If you could just put them through that process, and then we'll talk about rescheduling. So we have a chicken and egg scenario that is not in the industry's favor.
So just to interject there, Elliot, actually, we also have the same circular argument almost reflected in the medical cannabis industry at the moment. So as you know, I mean, it's why everyone knows this, that there are only medical cannabis is only available on the NHS for 3 indications. It's ridiculous. Even though there are 1.4 to 2 million people allegedly using it illicitly for self-medication. This makes no sense. Only 3 or 4 prescriptions have actually been given out on the NHS to date. It just makes no sense. So how does the argument go? The NICE guidelines are too restrictive. So the researchers say, this is for the public benefit. We need funding. Government, you should fund this. Give us the money. This is for NHS. This is for all these people. The government returns. Hang on a second, guys. Sorry. This has cost billions of pounds. We can't recoup our investment. You're going to have to fund the trials. You're going to make the profit from this. To which the researchers go, well, hang on a second. No, this is not for our benefit. This is for the benefit of the people. This is so the NHS can issue it. So surely you should fund it. But then the government goes, oh, maybe you should fund it. Well, no, maybe you should fund it. Well, maybe you should fund it. Repeat ad nauseum.
No, you. Anyway, as we can see, the argument goes round and round, and it comes back to the same question. Is the government open-minded enough to see psychoactive medicine as a public health necessity for the benefit of the country and fund and legislate accordingly? Or are we going to let decision-making be influenced by stories from the past that we know are not true?
I just think girl gives birth to a frog. I would blame 5-MeO, not LSD to that. But, there we go. Oh, my God, I'm in the letters.
Whereas these arguments may have slowed down research, the good news is it hasn't stopped it going ahead. So let's have a look at what studies are going on in the UK at the moment.
Okay, so we're going to play a little game right now, a little bit of interaction, just to keep things a little bit interesting, a little bit more engaging. So we're going to play a game called Guess That Molecule. So let's test all our scientific and other knowledge on this subject. So I'm going to bring up a little list of molecules. Well, by the way, these are companies that are UK companies that are currently conducting clinical trials with these molecules. So are you ready? What's that one?
If you can see it.
Can anyone see that? Is that okay? Do anyone have an idea?
Give you a hint. It's a short-acting psychedelic.
Spirit molecule.
Very good. Yes, it's DMT.
Well done.
That's small pharma going ahead, and they're looking at that to treat major depressive disorder at the moment.
Next, ribbit. Well done.
Very good.
You know your stuff, clearly. Right, that's Beckley Psytech, and they're doing, they've just actually dosed their first patients within the last month, I think, for safety profiles and pharmacokinetics, which is very interesting. So they're in their phase 1. Next molecule. Come on, this is the classic. There we go.
Immediately.
Nice necklace, Mags. And that's been done by Compass Pathways. And obviously they're using this for TRD and PTSD. Interesting enough, they're also using their own patented formula, COMP360. And finally, last but not least, come on, Weekend Warriors. Who knows this one?
No, this is good.
Oh, well, now we know what kind of Weekend Warrior you are.
That is, of course, MDMA. Yes.
There we go.
Yeah, pushing forward by Awaken here in the UK for alcohol use disorder.
Right. So suffice to say that a full-blown launch and legalization for psychedelics is still some time off. There's still a lot of work to be done, a lot of evidence to build, and not to mention this stigma to smash. But having said this, there really isn't a forged path to full-blown legalization. It could happen within months. It could happen within weeks. It could happen tomorrow, probably not. But there is no precedent for this. If this could happen within months, and these arguments are resolved, the best we can do now is to continue the campaign, raise awareness of the healing power of these compounds, and keep knocking at the door, keep providing the evidence. We already see that debates are being held in Parliament, I think, which was raised earlier. Certain MPs going so far as to propose more lenient regulations to allow these compounds to be studied with more ease. Crispin Blunt raised the topic of psilocybin. It was acknowledged by Boris Johnson. I'm not sure what's that saying about the current government and how much we believe Boris Johnson is going to do anything about it. But the conversation has started. It may be the case that we see decriminalization happen in order to simply develop working groups and devise proper regulatory plans in order to fully ensure a robust framework exists for when legalization eventually does happen, as we're seeing in Oregon, for example.
Now, so we have touched on how the MHRA are involved. That is our country's medicines regulator. We've talked about how the government's involved and the Home Office in terms of scheduling and licensing. It's all rather slow. Another question that comes up, are there any other parties at play here who could help achieve a fairer state of affairs in the meantime, before medical progress carves a way for rescheduling? Any ideas? Lloyd, yeah, good.
I like it.
We're trying. Yeah, anyone else? Yeah, or the media could help enormously because I won't say they started it, but
you obviously
in the 50s. I was thinking the police and how we've had a little bit out today already, how decriminalization could work and where it fits in. To take one example, you may have heard of a private initiative called CanCard in relation to cannabis. CanCard are a private company that issue cards to those who would be medically entitled to a private prescription based on their condition, but don't have a prescription, perhaps because of the high cost. They garner support from senior members of the police and MPs, and the card is designed to encourage police to use their discretion with cardholders. The card doesn't operate by any sort of legal exemption. It's just sensible police internal policy.
Now, could this type of initiative work for psychedelics? Well, look, it's tricky to say. Okay, so particularly in terms of the experience when consuming a psychedelic compound, these are trips that can last up to 9 hours and vary dramatically in intensity and understanding. Do we think it would be safe and practical to turn a blind eye to people conducting basically therapy on themselves prior to actually regulated and safe access? Probably not. One element we have to take into account with the psychedelic medicine is the therapy part of it. The understanding of the hallucinatory experience, the integration that follows the psychedelic session. On the other hand, look, people are doing it anyway. Arresting them is not going to help one iota. Although we might see in the future, like some medicines, for example, ketamine, Janssen's Spravato, the intranasal medical device can be used by itself because it's properly dosed. It has a high safety profile. And we see businesses around, particularly ketamine, like Ket-Dash in the States, who are actually delivering safely ketamine to their homes. So this might be a route. Anyway, as I mentioned earlier, an obvious and logical step to acceptance of psychedelics on the route to legalization is, of course, decriminalizing activities involving the drugs. We can draw somewhat of a parallel with cannabis sector here. Now, the gradual healing benefits of the cannabis plant are finally being recognized, and that its use is no more dangerous than you've been led to believe. From shameful advertising campaigns that you've seen earlier, mired with racism, to mendacious comments that we've been fed, it's no wonder there's so much trepidation over fully legalizing this. Perhaps even members of the government are actually starting to believe their own lies. Whilst cannabis remains illegal for adult recreational use, we all know that medical cannabis has been legalized in this country. The first step before we can make the jump to full-blown legal use often begins with the therapeutic or medical application of the substance. If it is shown to be safe for consumption, even in a medical setting, then it really does provide a huge evidence base and strong argument to allow cannabis to be legally used and consumed autonomously. The knock-on effect of legal medical cannabis in the UK has definitely helped change the perception of cannabis use and its users. There's an almost accepted understanding, almost an acquiescence that the plant might have been quietly decriminalized, barring any overt use or abuse of the substance, and obviously keeping within a certain amount of sensibility while using it. Now, like I said, the levels of acquiescence are not to be ignored. It may be that this would be the route to legalization. We know prohibition doesn't work. It can kill. We need greater and easier access to fully understand the health and safety elements of these compounds in order to confidently advise on guidelines around their use.
So that's the decriminalization side. But coming back to the current regulated industry, what are we seeing? What does the future hold? Well, clients have come to us with weird and wonderful compounds, new compounds, old compounds. We've seen theoretical compounds that don't exist yet. They've asked us everything from the simplest question, is this lovely compound legal, to the more complex, how do we get this to market, step by step, including manufacture,
import,
distribution,
clinical trials,
IP,
and finally regulatory approval and market authorization.
We've been approached by multiple charities in the sector, as Madge was touching on, clients wishing to compliantly offer retreats in the UK and international jurisdictions. We've seen mental health indications, inflammation-related indications, wellness and spiritual growth endeavors. Clients who just wish to transport psychedelics. The list has surprised us, and it just goes to show how diverse the upcoming industry is, and also that we are at the tip of the iceberg of the psychedelic healthcare revolution. To take one example, a client came to us not so long ago asking for advice, working with a compound, and it was an old Shulgin tryptamine. So I asked them what they're using it for, as you generally do. And they said, oh, we're just trying to find some compounds that we can work with in the lab. And they gave me sort of a vague answer. It's very odd, I thought. Normally the researchers are really keen to tell us what they're up to. So I asked again. And they said, oh, really, no, it's nothing interesting. We're trying to develop a sleep medication. We think this might be an interesting one to look at. So I thought, okay, fair enough. Anyway, then I went back and I looked in TCAL. I'm going to read you what the entry said, and I'm going to let you decide whether it was consistent with what I was being told. So this is what it said. Here we go. It produced intermittent skin alerting, especially on the head and neck. Everything is tactile. Sexual activity at 90 minutes showed marked enhancement of both the pre-climactic and orgasmic phase, which was confirmed by repeat activity at 120 and 180 minutes. The erection of my nipples is almost painful, word for word. I'm glad I'm alone because I cannot wear clothing. Anything touching the skin makes my hair stand on end. We're just researching a sleep medication. Maybe. So it's not all doom and gloom. And obviously the more serious point here is that the underground pharmacopoeia from the 50s all the way to the 90s is a treasure trove, not just for treating the most intractable mental health issues, but for a plethora of other difficulties too. Tools to heal intimacy, tools to heal relationships, everything from inflammation to neurodegenerative disorders. The more we learn, the more we realize how important it is for the law to help and not hinder.
Yeah, moving on from Papa Shulgin's onanistic tendencies there, we've even seen clients come to us with psychedelics that aren't even psychedelic, which raises an important point. Is the hallucinogenic experience an essential part of the treatment? If the trip was removed, would there be less need to control the compounds legally? Now, the term I've heard a lot bandied around is pseudodelics, and this may be another potential route to further acceptance of psychedelic medicines and clear a path to more lenient regulation. Now, pseudodelics, as you might know, are basically psychedelic compounds, but without the psychedelic element. Sorry, Siri. This could be a potential future for medicine and a further embrace of these compounds. Maybe not everyone will want the full-on mind-melting ego-death psychedelic experience. This is intimidating. Maybe in this way, it would be much safer to allow people to consume these medicines by themselves on prescription instead of having to attend a long and potentially very expensive therapy session. The government may be more inclined to loosen or even reschedule some of these novel pseudodelics to provide much easier access due to this higher safety profile. The patient taking the medicine would be taking it as any other medication, and the doctor's prescribing would not have to worry about the potential loss of control that could accompany a trip. It would be just like taking any other pill. Again, this shows us how diverse and wide-ranging the application of these compounds can be, providing not only a huge mental benefit, but also spiritual and physical benefits too. These medicines are amazing. They only do good. It would be absolutely bonkers not to assume that we haven't been consuming psychedelics for millennia. The society has been founded on psychedelic compounds. They have been part of our lives ever since flora began developing on this planet. How has it surpassed that we have found ourselves legally restricting them in such an extreme and unfounded way, treating them as evil, demonic presence with the only intention to cause harm and fear? This is propaganda.
Yeah, so unfortunately, there are unintended consequences of the media, as it was discussingly mentioned earlier, and also of the law. We're going to very quickly just touch on one or two examples of laws that have had unintended consequences and are in need of changing. Now, you may have heard of the Proceeds of Crime Act. Anyone come across it? Yeah, it's designed to stop criminal organizations laundering huge sums of money as a result of their fraud, violence, theft, but it's interfering with the global cannabis and psychedelics industries at the moment. The reason is that part of the Act, in short, states that any funds generated from an activity that's lawful in one jurisdiction are nevertheless treated as criminal property in the UK if that same activity is prohibited in the UK, even if it's lawful in the jurisdiction that it's taking place in. So, example, any US or Dutch recreational cannabis companies or psychedelic wellness companies can't pay their professional advisors in the UK with their revenues. They can't invest in the UK psychedelics or cannabis industry, or any for the matter, at a time when the industry desperately needs investment to get off the ground. It seems like a pretty big legal bottleneck. Now, the whole point of the law is to make things safer. At the moment, if you zoom out, it's doing the opposite. The good news is there are great things to come, and we know the law can help tremendously if it's developed and applied sensibly.
So to take one example, you might be aware of the MHRA recently introducing the Ilab Scheme, which stands for the Innovative Licensing Access Pathway, which basically aims to dramatically speed up or expedite the route to market for new medicines. Now, there must be some sort of understanding, or there's a conflation of ideas where we see these psychedelic compounds rising and these new regulatory pathways sort of developing. So there might be something to be said that the government are listening, the regulators are listening. A number of companies are already utilizing this pathway as well for psychedelic compounds. So this is a good thing. We are seeing movement slowly but surely.
Our final question, what can you do to get involved? And how can we bring about change? We've had a lot of suggestions today anyway. Some efforts go towards changing the law directly, such as writing to MPs, starting and signing petitions, offering help to lobbying groups, think tanks, policy institutes, or just writing articles and getting across the message that the country is in support of open-minded approaches to solving these problems. But we can also bring about change by pushing the industry forward. And I'd say think very broadly in that respect. Participate in clinical trials. Offer your professional skills to companies in the industry. If you have marketing skills, see if the psychedelic companies need marketing. If you have legal skills, write to us. If you need help on any other front, try and approach them. And if you have strong industry knowledge of the plants and chemicals themselves, don't underestimate your long accumulated rebel wisdom and keep your eyes out for any opportunities coming in this vital healthcare revolution.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you both so much. Everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Brilliant.
Where's that necklace? Look at that. Isn't that lovely?
Yeah.
Got to get me one of those.
Well, can we just talk about your trainers for a minute?
I know, right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to go as psychedelic as possible.
You guys are coming like psychedelic uniform. I love it.
Does anyone know what that compound is?
Yay. Excellent stuff. So we've got about 5 or 6 minutes now for some questions. Are there any questions in the audience? Yes, one at the back. I'm not going to be able to reach over there. Would you mind saying it very loudly and clearly, or come up with the microphone? Is that okay?
Like to...
I hate asking questions, but I have to.
We hate answering them, it's fine.
The first question was, you said that we need one medicine to go all the way through, and that would be like a pilot that would help the others. That was my understanding. But ketamine's gone through, hasn't it? So I was curious about that.
So this is interesting. Now, ketamine has been approved and does have what we call marketing authorization. It's the UK regulator, MHRA, saying, yes, that's safe. But it was approved as an anesthetic. It's approved for pain and things like that. And
way back in the 60s, I think, yeah.
Yeah. And actually, obviously, there's lots of horror stories. It's a horse tranquilizer, it's horse, but actually it's used to sedate children and the elderly. It's very gentle. I was going
to say, so if ketamine was going to go through another regulatory approval, it would be for another indication. It would be for mental health. As we know, it does have antidepressant properties, but unfortunately you can't prescribe ketamine now for that indication because it doesn't have regulatory approval.
Unless, you're absolutely right, unless you're doing it under this special route, because you're saying we've got a medicine that's designed off-label, for one thing, and we're going to use it for something else. It is happening. We're seeing it, in as you say, in sort of NHS trusts and things like that. But I think what we need the regulators to do, as Nick said, is look at the psychedelic compound for the indication it's intended, and that's when the safety and efficacy come in.
But that's not to say that we are seeing, so as we mentioned earlier, Awaken have just opened up a clinic in London as well. They've got 3 now, I think, one in Bristol, one in Norway, and now one in London. So, ketamine is the pilot pioneer, I guess, the star of these psychedelic medicines to begin with. But still, this is a very expensive treatment. It's not accessible for everyone. So we need greater access. We need greater understanding.
Thank you. Can I ask my second one?
Go for it.
So I do psychedelic integration psychotherapy. Is there anything I need to be thinking about?
Do you want to?
Well, I mean, we're not really a therapist.
No, I'd say it's interesting.
I know, yeah. Well, I know. I see where you're going with that one, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, I did a little bit on this in an earlier talk we did, I think about a year ago. It was looking at the legal risks for psychedelic therapists. And the conclusion I came to is it's actually relatively safe, funnily enough. And we're talking about the future, not about right now, because it's actually very difficult in law to sort of attract liability as a therapist in a classic setting as it is. There's just the legal tests you have to run through, causation, remoteness, and things like this. You'd have to demonstrate that a therapist's behavior fell below the standard of a reasonably competent therapist. And by putting a psychedelic in there, it doesn't seem to change that risk profile much. But it's an interesting one. We should talk about further.
Yeah.
Any more psychedelic questions?
Oh, okay. I'll read the one from Zoom.
Yeah, we've got one here. So on WhatsApp.
Okay, one from WhatsApp. I see in a Vice documentary that people are openly talking about currently growing psychedelic mushrooms in the UK or facilitating ceremonies using psychedelic mushrooms in East London. Is it safe to be so open about this still, as it's a Schedule 1 drug in the UK?
Well, these are illegal. So, from a legal perspective, from a lawyer's perspective, these shouldn't be conducted. So that's something I can say on that. But as you know, these things do happen. So I guess what one of the positives that could come out of these clandestine ceremonies would be possibly spreading the word. I would say letting people understand that the danger isn't actually so prevalent as it's been led to believe. The stigma isn't there anymore, and people will go to ceremonies, perhaps, and have a great experience. They might share that with friends. They might share that with family. The message will spread. The positivity will snowball, and we might see it affecting a much wider part of the population. Maybe even someone in government. Maybe even someone who might be able to make policy change.
Is there a point there though around maybe the harm reduction message as well, for people who might not be in a fit state to take part in a ceremony?
Well, also the thing is, we've got to bear in mind that one of the things about harm reduction is there has to be people who are going to be supervising this, who actually know and are experienced in dealing with this. So I wouldn't recommend at all not taking these drugs, because I'm a lawyer and they're illegal, but also making sure if you do happen to find yourself in a situation you are consuming, that you do it safely and you do it with people who are responsible and who know about this, and you know how to deal with any possible altercations or problems that could arise. But they probably won't.
Thank you. Okay, question here.
Well, just to turn the last question, but one was about LSD therapy and it being illegal and the legal ramifications of administering it. Can I flip that around and say, can I sue the NHS for when I had a bad trip and had 6 weeks in psychiatric hospital? They gave me antipsychotics, which did not resolve any of the issues that the LSD trip had been brought out. They just suppressed them. I took LSD again 18 years later and felt it resolved many of the issues that should have been resolved during the first bad trip. So can I actually sue the NHS solicitors for giving me antipsychotics instead of LSD in hospital?
Let's chat.
I'd have much rather have tripped out in hospital than had antipsychotics.
I can't think of anything worse than tripping out in a hospital, but there you go.
It's very difficult. Yeah, you've got to look at what people knew at the time. What was the state of knowledge? Did clinicians do everything they thought was right? And actually, in law, it's very difficult to apportion legal blame to the medical profession. In the case, I think it was Crown against Bolam. It's called the Bolam test, and they found in 11 11 in 1,000 medical professionals would do the same course of action, the doctors won't be liable. It's really tricky, but hopefully as that broadens out, we'll get better answers.
Well, maybe in a lot of time, like, this is, like you say, this is 1983.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's tough. It's tough because you're competing against, medical professionals who have protocols that have been in place for decades, and we're coming at this with new medicines, new compounds, with which has mind-blowing results for mental health. So I would have a little bit of sympathy maybe for the medical professionals who are maybe hesitant, just because we're entering a whole new world here, a whole new paradigm of medicines. This has never happened. There's been no precedent for this. So like you said before, the evidence building, the positivity, the message, the stigma, this all needs to be smashed. This all needs to be delivered.
So I've got a question. Well, actually, a couple of things. First up, I think I speak on behalf of all of the Always Sunny in Philadelphia fans here that we're very disappointed that it didn't start with, we're lawyers.
I don't specialize in bird law.
There we go.
That's fine.
It wouldn't have, it doesn't look like that would have landed. The second thing,
Great show. Great show.
So one of your slides, you're talking about how we've got all of these, a lot of research kind of moving forward, essentially funded by the private sector. And it felt to me that you're essentially asking us to, support private sector initiatives, which is fine. But when it comes to a company like Compass Pathways, which founded and major shareholder is Peter Thiel, who is the funder of the American far right, and a lot of other terrible things. Do you have any kind of feeling about that through essentially investing all of our trust in the private sector, that we may be digging a hole for ourselves further down the line?
Well. As lawyers, we can't take too much of a political stance on this, I would say. Thiel, he also is an investor in Atai as well. So this guy's got his fingers in a lot of psychedelic pies. Whether he's taken them, I don't know. But no, I mean, Elliot.
Yeah, and it's a very, very good question, and it leads on to other ones as well about IP. People have criticised some of these companies you talked about, because they're going out and they're trying to stop other people from helping people with these medicines by using very restricted patents. It's a question that's going to come up, but it's difficult, because while most people can't trust the government, on the other side of the fence, which one do we pick? And we end up
it's difficult to conflate. It's difficult to conflate politics with healthcare as well, because essentially, if Peter Thiel wants to invest, and there's a lot of money, it's billions and billions of pounds are required to develop these compounds. If he's willing to give the money, they're willing to take it. I can't see anything wrong with that. It depends on what his other goals would be to fund it, to be honest. Well, I mean, we have to think about this. We have to get access to these compounds as quickly and to as many people as possible. The money's going to do that. Money's going to facilitate that. But
we will always have this tension, won't we, between we found at every level that the largest, even down to the teeniest decisions with the most insignificant market participants, you've got the healthcare and the benefit of the public versus commercialization. You can't get these treatments into the hands of the patients who need them without money, and it's a shame. What I'm hoping is that by the time we get there, it will be so well funded that this information will be free, and people will be able to jump on it for the private and public too.
Thank you. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you both so much, Elliot and Nick.